All right, so part two of our video lecture this week is simply going to focus on this budget development process. So basically a series of steps a sport organization would go through in order to develop their budget. Now keep in mind that this is just one example process, like there are other um, processes out there with different steps or at least different versions of these steps. So keep in mind this is just one of those potential budget development processes you might see. But I think in general, a lot of these steps would be covered in a number of the processes that are out there. Okay, so step one is going to be to develop a budget calendar. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what this means. Basically, this just means that you're setting up your budget based on the time period in which you want to actually allocate and spend that money, right? And every sport organization might be different in terms of their budget calendar. I will say that most professional sports organizations and most college sport organizations are operating on an annual budget calendar, meaning that the budget they develop is for a year's time, right? 12-month period, a fiscal year, if you will. So that's probably the most common type of budget calendar utilized, but there are some other ones, as you can see here, right? Some organizations might prefer to budget on a monthly time period, meaning that they just budget 1 month at a time. Probably not, very efficient, especially if you're a major sport organization to do that. But that is one option. Others might do a quarterly budget, meaning they're planning 3 months out at a time, and they do that 4 times throughout the year. We already talked about an annual budget. Beyond that, there are some other budget calendars that sport organizations use. Budget planning horizon is a 3 to 5 year planning period. So think about why a sport organization might need to plan out 3 to 5 years in advance, right? I'll use ISU athletics as an example. They might know as a department that, hey, in 3 years we're going to need to purchase a new scoreboard system. So they would plan for that using this budget planning horizon calendar. And it's possible that, ISU Athletics has their annual budget as well as, a more long-term budget where they're planning for things like that. Additionally, one could use a strategic planning horizon, which is really anything that would require, 5 years on, right? So something that you might be planning for long term. You think back to some of our initial conversations about sport finance, and we talked about things like capital spending, right? And capital projects, these major projects that require years of planning, that require years of fundraising. That's the type of project that would fall into a strategic planning horizon, right? So, aspect of a budget or planning period that goes beyond 5 years. For ISU athletics, again, I think of Horton Fieldhouse as a project that they've been planning for a long time now and budgeting for a long time. And, at the end of the day, it will probably be more than 5 years worth of planning. So it's important to understand that these are the different time periods that a sport organization might be looking at when they're developing their budget calendar. For our purposes in this class, we're going to focus on this time period of an annual budget because, again, I think it's probably the most common one that you would see when you're working for and on behalf of a sport organization. And the budget assignment that you're going to work on later in the semester is based on a 12-month budget. All right, so once that calendar is put in place or you've determined the time period in which you want that budget to be implemented, you can move on to step two, which is the planning and forecasting phase, which we've already previewed a little bit, but we'll talk a little bit more about this planning and forecasting process here in step two. So if you remember, in our initial definition of budgeting, we said that all budgets are essentially based on two things. It's planning and forecasting, right? So planning meaning the sport organization has taken into account the specific goals and objectives they want to accomplish in that upcoming year. That's the planning piece. And then based on those goals and objectives they've determined, they have to actually forecast what they're going to generate in terms of revenue and how much they're going to spend in terms of expenses. So that's a very brief overview, again, of this planning and forecasting phase, but we did already kind of preview it earlier. I do want to give you a little bit more detail here in terms of what are some guidelines you might use in that forecasting process. So, we looked at that example earlier about how a college athletic department might try to forecast or predict, how many new donors they might bring in or how much more revenue they might bring in from those donors. And it might make a little bit more sense if we look at some specific guidelines for forecasting. So, one guideline is that when forecasting, sport organizations should certainly rely on historical information they have to make predictions, right? So use that information to your advantage, right? Information you might have as a sport organization, whether it's looking at, the last 3 to 5 years of revenues and expenses. That can certainly be very helpful in trying to make predictions for the current budget period. You might look at past relationships, right? What was our, ticket revenue like when we were winning games as a team? What was it like when we were losing games? Do we need to consider that as we're forecasting for the following year? So using historical information is a great way to accurately forecast. And then another one is to look at objective estimates and costs. Now this one comes into play when you're trying to forecast expenses, right? So an example I'll use is for ISU athletics. If you go to a football or basketball game, you see this big blow up piece that they use so the players can run out onto the field or the court, right? So let's say that ISU marketing in athletics is looking to replace their current blow up, right? And they want to work it into the budget for the upcoming year. So they're going to have to forecast what the cost will be, right? So one thing they might do is, get a bunch of different estimates, right? They might look at several companies that have the ability to make these blow-ups, and they would look at those estimates. They're objective, right? They're coming from different companies around the country. They would look at those estimates and then make a determination for what they're going to forecast in the budget for that year, right? So that's pretty standard, pretty straightforward guideline when you're looking to forecast expenses, especially when you're talking about a tangible item like that. One other guideline for forecasting that I think is key, and one that we already mentioned a little bit, is considering external forces, right? We said there are a number of external forces that we simply can't control within the sport organization, but that is likely going to impact our budget, right? Either from a revenue perspective or an expense perspective. So in forecasting, you always want to consider those external forces, right? Whether it's the economy, whether it's different trends that are happening within the industry. Maybe you're looking at participation rates. Maybe you're looking to see different trends in terms of ticket packages that are being offered or different types of events that are being held for a sport organization. Whatever it might be, you're looking at external forces and how they might impact your forecasting for your upcoming budget. Let's look at one more example here. So similar to the development example I showed you earlier, but now we've talked a little bit more about forecasting, and hopefully you're able to do this one on your own. So I'll give you the premise here and then give you a chance to think about it. So here we've got a professional soccer team. In the planning process, they've determined that a goal of theirs is to update the facility in order to make it more comfortable and accessible to fans. Okay, that's their goal. Some of the specific objectives in the planning process are purchase and replace the outdated seats in the club area of the stadium and purchase visual listening devices for hearing impaired fans, right? Those objectives align with their goal. This is something they determine in the planning process. Again, now we have to forecast, right? So for the sport organization, they have to try to predict the costs associated with both replacing these outdated seats and purchasing these visual listening devices, right? So I want you to just take a minute or two and think about some of the factors the team should consider when forecasting these expenses. And feel free to pause if you want to pause and jot down some notes and then come back. Okay. So when we think about the different factors the team might consider here if they want to accurately forecast these expenses, I want us to go back to the last slide where we highlighted some guidelines, right? And I really think in this scenario, we could probably utilize all these guidelines to try to predict costs. So, in terms of using historical information, the team could go back in their historical records and see what the, construction costs were the last time they updated seating in the stadium, right? That would be one way of sort of assessing what their expenses are going to be in order to update these particular seats, right? They could also probably get a few more estimates, right? Might reach out to a few new companies that they haven't dealt with before that are also known for stadium seating. This would give them some objective estimates as to what it might actually cost to do that in real time, right? So the combination of those two would probably help get them to a solid estimate for what it's going to cost. Additionally, they also want to consider external forces, right? Depending on the type of material that's being used to construct those seats, they might want to consider, whether or not construction costs have gone up or gone down, or the types of materials. There was a time here recently where steel costs went up because of, the U.S. government's trade relations. So, thinking about all of these external factors that could impact the cost of the seats that are being built, the labor surrounding installing them, you can see how all of these guidelines might play a role in trying to accurately predict the costs associated with these things. So, again, I would say if you're given a scenario like this on a practice case or on an exam, just be prepared to kind of apply the guidelines to forecasting to a real life scenario that you might see. Okay, so moving on here to step 3 and step 4, I'm going to talk about these together because they are very similar and kind of go together. When we think about the budget development process, obviously the key pieces to that budget are the expenses and the revenues, right? So for a sport organization, it's important to, one, develop an expense budget and then also a revenue budget. So identifying what our expenses are going to be for the upcoming budget period, and also what are we going to predict our revenues are going to be? How much money are we going to be bringing in over that same time period? Okay, so as we think about the expense piece or the development of the expenses portion of the budget, it's also important that we think about how we're actually allocating those expenses in a budget, right? It's not like we're dealing with just one pot of money, right? Oftentimes in a sport organization, there are different departments, right? And those departments might utilize resources less or more than other departments. So what often ends up happening is, the management determines how expenses will be allocated within that budget. And there are different approaches to this. We're going to identify 3 different approaches to allocating expenses. This first one is called equal share, right? This one is very straightforward. Basically, the decision is that the expenses or the costs are going to be shared equally across departments, right? So this one's pretty easy to implement. Percentage of budget. In this approach, costs are designated based on the percentage of the budget each department accounts for. So meaning in terms of how much spending occurs or how many resources are coming from that particular department, that's the percentage of the budget that department accounts for. And then finally, time budget study approach. Costs are designated based on the amount of time that person or piece of equipment attributes to each department. Okay. Now, I think a lot of this will make more sense when we actually look at a practice case. So let's do that. Okay. So in this practice case, we're looking at the hiring of a new employee and how this local park district is going to allocate that person's salary across the budget. All right, so let me read the case to you here. So the director for our local park district has decided to hire a maintenance director to manage all of the maintenance of the various parks and rec facilities. She has determined this position will carry an annual salary of $75,000. So that's the total expense, right? The park district's annual budget reveals that 40% of costs are associated with aquatics, 40% are associated with parks, and 20% are associated with sports, right? So when she looks at the overall budget, she sees that sort of that's where the spending, the output is coming from, right? 40% aquatics, 40% parks, and 20% sports. Additionally, the director predicts that this person will spend 20% of their time managing maintenance in aquatics, 50% of their time on parks, so the bulk of their time on parks, and the remaining 30% on sports. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the time balance. So using all this information, what I want you to do is calculate how the maintenance director's salary would be allocated across the three areas using those three different approaches that we just defined, right? So allocate the salary based on equal share, percentage of budget, and time budget study. And again, feel free to pause, give it a try, and then come back and we can review together. Okay, so let's start with equal share here. I mentioned on the last slide that this is the easiest one to implement, right? It's pretty straightforward. So in this case, we know that using the equal share budget allocation approach, we're just going to share the costs equally across the various departments, right? So we know we have a $75,000 salary. We're going to split that three ways. That means that $25,000 will be allocated to aquatics, $25,000 to parks, and $25,000 to sports, right? So equal share, again, very straightforward implementation. You're just splitting up whatever the expense is equally across the various departments. Now, you could certainly ask whether or not this is an efficient way to allocate expenses, right? There doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to it. Or a whole lot of thought put into the process, but it certainly could be seen as a fair share approach, right? Every department is going to pay their fair share. All right, let's look at the percentage of budget. Again, the percentage of budget, the costs are designated based on what percentage of the budget each department accounts for, right? So we found out in the case here that 40% of the costs of the park district are associated with aquatics. So if we take that 40% of the maintenance director's salary, we get $30,000, right? We see that 40% is also coming from parks, so we would do the same, right? So 40,000 would be another 30,000, sorry, 40% would be another 30,000 for parks, and then that remaining 20% is coming from sports, so they would only have to account for 15,000, right? So again, this is based on percentage of budget. So the bulk of the budget comes from aquatics and parks in terms of spending. So they're going to pay more towards the maintenance director salary than the sports department. Hopefully that makes sense. This last approach is this time budget study, right? So here we're looking at the amount of time the individual is going to allocate to each department and then basing the breakdown on that. So we know from the case that the maintenance person is likely going to spend 20% of their time managing maintenance projects in aquatics. So if we do 20% of the 75,000, we see that just 15,000 would be allocated to aquatics based on the amount of time spent there. 50% of their time is going to be spent on parks. So if you take 50% there, sorry, I just messed that up. 50% there, you see that that would account for 37,500, and then 30% for sports, so that leaves them with 22,500. So you can see here that determining the approach you want to use to allocate those expenses is going to have an impact on the various departments, right? So for instance, using the time budget study, Parks is going to end up paying way more of the maintenance director's salary than they would have if they had gone with the equal share approach, right? Keep in mind that every sport organization is different in how they might determine which approach is appropriate, right? And those decisions have to be made by the people that are putting together that budget, right? And there's going to be a lot of information that might play a role into the decisions they make surrounding how different expenses are allocated. But it's important to know that there are these three different approaches to doing that so that there are options given, the information about the particular budget item. Okay. The next step in the budget development process, once you've put together the expenses and revenues component of the budget, is to simply modify and finalize the budget, right? This is a great step for the folks involved in the process to kind of take a minute, take a step back, and ask some important questions, right? Does the budget we put together actually align with the goals and objectives and the mission of our organization, right? Kind of going back to that initial slide about what a budget is and what it's based on. So this is a great stage or part of the process to do that, to really make some changes based on what you put together so far, and also kind of a great opportunity to bring in other stakeholders, other people that maybe haven't been involved in the process yet, but certainly are internal stakeholders that are going to be impacted by that budget. Step 6, once the budget's finalized, you can actually present, defend, and seek approval, right? So this is actually taking the budget you put together and presenting it to any final decision makers, right? Now, who it provides approval in these instances? Well, it really depends on the sport organization, right? If you are a professional sports team, it's probably the owner of the team that's ultimately signing off on the budget for the upcoming time period, right? If it's a college athletic department, it's probably the athletic director that's signing off on that final budget. If it's a public park district, there's probably some kind of board, right, that has to provide final approval. So you get the idea here. It really does depend on the organization in terms of who has to provide that final approval. And obviously, it's important to know if you're in the budget development process, you have to know who the final, approval is coming from, right? Because that might impact the way that you present and deliver that information. All right. Step 7 of the budget, probably the most important and also most time consuming part of the budget development process, is actually administering and evaluating that budget, right? So, like I said earlier, the budget development process is not something that we start on a Monday and finish on a Friday, right? This is a process that is ongoing and continual, right? So, once the budget's been approved, of course, it's actually going to be administered, meaning that we're actually going to spend the money we said we were going to spend and hopefully bring in the money we said we were going to bring in. And that requires continual monitoring, right? One or two people, depending on the size of the organization, continually monitoring that budget and making sure that things are staying within the financial plan and things aren't going too far off course at any point throughout the budget period. One important thing to think about here is that if we're continually evaluating the budget, then we can make adjustments as needed, right? Versus if we kind of set aside the budget once it's put together and just pull it up at the end of the year, we're not going to be able to make adjustments, meaningful adjustments, right? So if there is this constant evaluation throughout the year, then adjustments can be made because, of course, not everything that we predict in that budget is going to come to fruition, right? Even if we spend all the time in the world forecasting to try to get accurate revenues, there's still going to be things that impact it, right? Whether it's external forces or other internal forces. So being able to make adjustments as we go is really key. Also important in terms of being able to evaluate the budget at the end of that time period, right? So what did we allocate versus what did we actually spend, right? And did we generate the revenues we established? And, if not, what do we need to change or consider for the next budget, right? What can we learn from the budget implementation of this budget so that we can improve the next time? Okay. So that's all I have in terms of part 2 of our budgeting unit. Like I said, this is just our initial introduction to budgeting. And this particular lesson was really focused on budgeting as a concept. And next week, we're really going to shift gears and talk more about practical implications, right? So what does it look like to actually put together a budget? What are the different approaches to managing that budget? And then we're actually going to get into Excel and talk about, cutback management and how we actually make changes to a budget in real time. So that's the plan. Hope you have a great week. Thanks.